Voyager, and welcome back to my Soviet Union vlog. This episode, we're going to think about starting about theme 3 in our course on the Soviet Union, which is about control of the Soviet people. And theme 3 considers really sort of two threads of this. One is which is the most effective control of the Soviet people that is used by the Soviet leadership, and compares a number of different types. And then also, how do those policies change over time? So all the way from 1917 through to 1985. In this episode, we're going to be looking at mass media, newspapers, magazines, TV, and radio. And then in subsequent episodes, we'll think about other forms of control. So quickly then, sort of run you through the policies of mass media, and we're going to try and do this and emphasise the change and continuity as we go. And what we'll do in a subsequent episode is we'll think about, well, is this more important or less important than other forms of control? So, I mean, first of all, the story of mass media starts out, of course, with Lenin in 1917. And Lenin's main aim with mass media is to control it. He wants complete control so that he can dominate, or his party can dominate the message going out to the Soviet people. And with that in mind, he restricted the freedom of the press. In November 1917, a decree was passed banning all non-socialist newspapers. And then later on, all non-Bolshevik papers were ended as well. And by 1921, as a result of this, the communists had closed 2,000 newspapers and 575 printing presses. In addition, in November 1917, a state monopoly was passed on advertising. In these first few years, control was also established by nationalising the printing press, by making editors and journalists all work for the government, and that's kind of like the not like the carrot, but the way of controlling them in. Also, and they set up the Revolutionary Tribunal of the Press in January 1918, which had the power to censor the press. I mean, importantly, journalists and editors who committed crimes against the people could be punished by the Cheka, the secret police, with fines or prison sentences, or the confiscation of property, or even exile, sending them away, probably to Siberia, to a gulag, rather than out of the country. In 1922, Glavlit was introduced, which is a more systematic censorship regime, working on the principle that the secret police was in charge of every publication available in the Soviet Union. And they compiled a list of banned books and even created purges of politically dangerous books, and held special libraries, which are called book gulags, where only senior party members could go and read and view these books. So it's quite tight control from the start of the mass media. And that focuses on newspapers, of course, because they are the mass media of the day. So there are two main newspapers that were established: Pravda, which means truth. That was the paper of the party, and Izvestia, which just means news. That was the newspaper of the government. And both of them were produced on a mass scale, very cheaply, and even pasted on boards in the street so that you could go and read them for free, because they were being used to put out the government's line about what was going on, how things were great, and how everything was going to move forward. At the same time as newspapers, radio was also controlled. In 1917, the Petrograd Telegraph Agency was nationalised. And this was a bit easier for the Bolsheviks because it was a much more modern, it was a much newer, more recent development in media. And radio receivers at that time were still very expensive. And so the Bolsheviks actually installed loudspeakers in public places to get their message across. By 1922, Moscow had a well-developed broadcasting system. And the idea behind this was it enabled to get the government's message out. So they're in favour of radio because they dominate it and control it. And in a population that was about 65% illiterate, of course, it's a much more effective way of getting a message out there. So that's a policy under Lenin. Now, Stalin continues that. You won't be surprised to learn. Stalin continues that and tightens it and looks for more control. And one of the great things about doing these cross the leaders' thematic views of things is that each leader's policy always reflects their personality. So Lenin often is a little bit more kind of a little bit more free at the start, but with some control. Stalin tends to control things more, and then that control reduces because Khrushchev and Brezhnev are less controlling characters all round. Anyway, so Stalin tightened the control that Lenin had. News shifts to being about targets and success in the economy in particular. In the war, radio becomes really, really invaluable, I guess, particularly during the German invasion. And when the German forces were less than 50 miles away from Moscow, Stalin famously gave a speech live on radio in Red Square. And his speeches were really, really effective, kind of the equivalent of Churchill's speeches in Britain, really effective at reassuring the Soviet population that he was still there and that they could keep going. Again, you won't be surprised to learn that he also increased censorship and tightened it. So in the mid-30s, for example, the works of Zinoviev and Kamenev, Trotsky, and other leading revolutionaries from the 20s were all purged out of the libraries. And even Lenin's own works were edited to remove statements that seemed to complement people that Stalin had purged since. So Stalin very much kind of tightening control. Now, after Stalin, Khrushchev and Brezhnev continue those policies, but they also, as I said, lighten up a bit. And Khrushchev does that in a tends to be a more proactive way, and Brezhnev in a slightly lazier way, I guess, because that's kind of how Brezhnev's regime worked. So, for example, in terms of continuity, bad news was still not published. This started very much under Stalin. You wouldn't hear about the disasters of the economy. You'd only hear the good stuff. Two examples of that. These are both from the textbook. In 1957, a nuclear waste storage tank exploded, killing 200 people immediately, exposing more than 250,000 people to radiation. The government took 2 years to evacuate the area and never reported the accident. In July 1972, there was a fire, massive fire. That got out of control quite near Moscow. In fact, apparently you could see the haze on the horizon from Moscow, but it wasn't reported on in the papers until it was almost out a month later. So bad news was not broadcast or printed or published, reported in the mass media. Another continuity was that the new apartment blocks that were put up, particularly in the Khrushchev era, were wired for radio reception. That in order to get the message out, and access was restricted to government stations only. So the government attempted, as time goes on, radio becomes more of a common medium. It's broadcast over wider bandwidth, I guess. Further away you can pick it up. The government attempted to restrict access to foreign stations, partly by producing cheap radio sets with limited reception, and partly by jamming foreign broadcasts and threatening to arrest those listening to foreign stations, such as the Voice of America or the BBC. Also, as we'll see, a bit of criticism was allowed in the 60s and 70s, generally of the Soviet regime, but not of the leader of the country. So that's all kind of continuity. In terms of continuity, but in different media, television, of course, makes its break in. And on television, it is used again to broadcast the same sort of message. So, in the same kind of propaganda way, that life in the Soviet Union is presented as joyous, and a contrast to life in the capitalist West, which is rife with crime and homelessness and violence. Between 1960 and 1964, Soviet TV is used to support what's going on in the Soviet regime, particularly in the space race, celebrating the space race, watching programs about Yuri Gagarin, and then in 1963, the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. And in both cases, emphasizing her ordinariness as a kind of Soviet hero, a hero of socialism, rather than a hero of like Western capitalism. And there was also a television news show, and that was first put out in 1961. That's called Estafeta Novosteo, News and Mail. And that, again, focused on the same sort of stuff that's been broadcast on the radio about Stalin's economic successes. It talked about model workers on farms and factories as part of the drive by Khrushchev to increase labour productivity. Similarly, then, Brezhnev continues to try and use TV to his advantages. They keep tight control, as Lenin and Stalin had, on the information in the Soviet Union about the war in Afghanistan from 1979, and are successful in restricting the amount of information that gets out about that. And they make sure that Brezhnev's speeches are transmitted in full to maximise how good that he looks, with limited success. I mean, they do broadcast them out, but by the late 70s, people also, because it's TV, the weakness of that is that they can see that he's kind of breaking down physically and mentally. He's struggling to walk up the steps. He becomes a bit confused in the middle of his speeches. And so there is continuity there with the policy, but it becomes less effective because of the medium of TV. So that's about the continuity. They continue to try and control things. They continue to try and use it for propaganda. But there are also changes. And these changes happen after Stalin, with Khrushchev and then Brezhnev trying to introduce a slightly more consumer based society. Part of that is that magazines proliferate, loads of them around, and radio and TV sets. There's an explosion in the amount of mass media, I guess, available to people. Good example of this is that magazines were encouraged to publish readers' letters, but those readers' letters then often complain about how things are going. They complain about how people can't buy things in the shops. They complain about alcoholism. They complain about inequality in childcare and housework and even at work. And these things are kind of things that in the perfect Soviet society shouldn't be happening. So they really undermine the vision that has been put out by the government of the perfect society. And actually, in response to this, Khrushchev's government in particular sort of ridicules things and satirizes stuff as a way of trying to make a message about them. So you have pictures of or cartoons of men being drunk, to almost kind of shame Soviet men into recognizing their own frailties and flaws. Until 1964, only one Soviet radio station actually existed, but under Brezhnev that expanded to three, and one of those, Radio Mayak, played some foreign music, very popular with the Soviet youth. And yeah, so an expansion in choice there. By the 60s, TV was becoming much more the thing. In fact, I've got a couple of stats for TVs in the 50s. In 1950, there were 10,000 TV sets in the Soviet Union. By 1958, there were 3 million TV sets. So obviously that's increasing dramatically through the 50s. And the price of those decreases as they go, so that by the early 80s, pretty much everyone in the Soviet Union had access to a TV set. And this is again, so that's a change in technology, of course, that is moving from just being the printed press through to radio, through to TV. So part of the change is what's available to people, and then also in the and increasing the number of radio stations, increasing the variety of programming that's available to them. And then also a shift away from being about the leader to being about the ordinary person. So that's seen in film. Films about the Civil War and then the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, as we would call it, are more about the ordinary man triumphing on behalf of the Soviet Union. And also in Brezhnev's era, in fact, they go one step further, and TV programs tend to be about fashionable citizens living in luxurious apartments and kind of feeding back into that loop of consumerism that they were sort of trying to promote a bit. And then, as we've said before, they try to keep control. But as foreign radio stations, for instance, become more available, so also print media became more available from the West too, on the black market. Tended to be consumer magazines like Vogue, for instance, and these weren't threatening necessarily the political regime, but they did undermine faith in how things were going because they expose how the West has higher living standards than the Soviet Union. Just one more positive feature of TV, local programming was used for the regions in the Soviet Union, and that allowed local language and local culture to be viewed and celebrated around the Soviet Union rather than the dominance of Russian culture, which had been seen earlier. So, a promotion of regional identity, a loss of control over time, a shift away from kind of great man to ordinary man focus in things, and a shift in allowing a shift in allowing a bit more kind of honesty in the system and criticism are all big changes in the mass media policy. So, how successful mass media is, just in finishing, I would say that it is quite successful in terms of presenting that image of the perfect Soviet regime, but that success declines over time. That as the media becomes more sophisticated, so it's harder and harder to control it. So at the start, the control is quite high. People are quite optimistic, and people kind of buy into this idea of the future is going to be great. As time goes on, the future doesn't become great, and so there's disaffection anyway, and the media starts to reflect that and tap into that. So probably if you're asking me how effectively do they control, I would say that they only really control in the first half, and then the effectiveness wears off. Hope that's useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.